The first gunshot of the morning tore through Eliza Foster's dreams like a bullet through paper, jolting her awake before the sun had even contemplated rising over the harsh Texas horizon. April 1875 had been crueler than most months in Austin, and this morning promised no reprieve as she pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. 3 small bodies huddled together on the single straw mattress in the corner of the one-room shack they called home, somehow sleeping through the distant commotion that had awakened their mother. Eliza's fingers trembled as she lit the stub of a candle, its feeble light casting long shadows across her children's faces. 10-year-old Sarah, with her father's dark curls. 8-year-old Thomas, thumb tucked securely in his mouth despite being too old for such comforts. And little Mary, barely 5, whose cheeks had grown increasingly hollow over these past months since their father had been lowered into the ground outside town. "Another day," Eliza whispered to herself, splashing water from the cracked basin onto her face. She studied her reflection in the shard of mirror propped against the wall. At 28, the lines around her eyes and mouth had deepened considerably since Jeremiah's passing. 6 months of struggling alone had taken their toll, yet beneath the weariness, traces of the beauty that had once turned heads throughout Austin remained. Her stomach growled, reminding her of the empty cupboard and the mouths she needed to feed. The rent was due tomorrow, and Mr. Halloway, their landlord, had made it abundantly clear that his patience had expired along with his sympathy for her situation. Eliza dressed mechanically, pulling on her best and only decent dress. The faded blue calico had been mended so many times that the original pattern was barely discernible in some places, but it was clean and presentable. As she fastened the buttons, her mind drifted to the proposition that had been whispered to her 3 nights ago behind the Silver Spur saloon. "Pretty widow like you could make good money," Madame Rosa had said, her painted lips curving into what might have been intended as a sympathetic smile. "Just a few gentlemen, discreet ones, enough to keep those little ones fed and that roof over your head." Eliza had fled then, clutching her dignity like a shield. But after another day of watching her children's hungry eyes and counting the dwindling coins in the tin box beneath her mattress, dignity seemed a luxury she could no longer afford. A soft moan from the mattress pulled her from her thoughts. Thomas was stirring, his small face contorted in a dream. Eliza knelt beside him, stroking his forehead until the tension eased from his features. "I'll fix this," she promised in a whisper. "Whatever it takes." She tucked a blanket around all 3 children, pressed kisses to their foreheads, and slipped out into the pre-dawn chill. The streets of Austin were eerily quiet as she made her way toward the livery stable where old Pete, the one person who had shown her consistent kindness, allowed her to earn a few pennies sweeping floors and feeding horses before the regular hands arrived. "Mornin', Miss Foster," Pete's gravelly voice greeted her as she entered the stable. "You're here mighty early." "Need the work, Pete," she replied simply. The old man nodded, understanding in his rheumy eyes. "Got some oats for the little ones," he said, pressing a small sack into her hands. "My missus baked extra." Eliza's throat tightened with gratitude. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll pay you back when—" "Nonsense," Pete interrupted. "Just helpin' a neighbor is all." The kindness nearly broke her, but Eliza straightened her shoulders and got to work. For 2 hours, she swept and scrubbed, her mind churning with the decision that lay before her. When the stable hands began to arrive, she collected her meager pay and headed to the general store. Mr. Wilkins eyed her sympathetically as she carefully counted out pennies for a small amount of flour, a few potatoes, and the cheapest cut of meat he had available. "That'll barely feed those young'uns of yours," he observed. "It'll do," Eliza replied, her voice betraying none of the desperation clawing at her insides. As she turned to leave, Mr. Wilkins called after her. "Ms. Foster, if you're looking for more work, I heard Zachary Owens is back in town. Bought that big spread north of here. The Rocking Z. Word is he's looking to hire help for the house." Eliza paused. "Zachary Owens, tall fella, quiet. Fought for the Confederacy, then went out California way for a spell. Made himself a fortune in cattle, from what I hear. Just moved back to Texas a month ago." Eliza vaguely remembered a serious young man who had left Austin before she had arrived with Jeremiah. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, though the idea of domestic service at her ranch miles from town seemed impractical with 3 young children to care for. By the time she returned to the shack, her children were awake and hungry. She forced a bright smile as she prepared a thin porridge, supplemented with a small portion of the oats Pete had given her. "Mama, when will there be more?" Thomas asked as he scraped his bowl clean. "Soon, darling," Eliza promised, her heart breaking at the innocent question. "Things will get better soon." After breakfast, she walked the children to the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. Education was the one gift she could still provide them, though she knew Sarah should rightfully be helping at home or finding work herself. But Eliza was determined that her daughter would have opportunities she herself had never been afforded. "Be good," she instructed, straightening Thomas's collar. "I have some errands to run, so mind Mrs. Peterson and help your brother and sister." Sarah's eyes, too wise for her years, studied her mother's face. "Are you all right, Mama?" Eliza cupped her daughter's cheek. "Of course, my love." "Now go on." As the children disappeared into the schoolhouse, Eliza allowed her shoulders to slump momentarily before squaring them again. She had until tomorrow to come up with the rent money, and only one path seemed available to her now. Her feet carried her toward the edge of town, where several clapboard houses stood apart from the respectable businesses of Austin. Even in daylight, the Painted Lady emanated an air of nocturnal promise, its windows covered with heavy curtains regardless of the hour. Eliza stood across the street, paralyzed by indecision. 3 hungry children, an imminent eviction. The memory of Jeremiah's face twisted in her mind. What would he think of her now? But Jeremiah was gone, and reality remained. Before she could take another step, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. A magnificent black stallion trotted down the main street, its rider cutting an imposing figure against the morning sky. The man sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders draped in a duster that had seen its share of trails and tribulations. A worn Stetson was pulled low over his eyes, but there was no disguising the confidence in his posture as he guided the horse toward the general store. Eliza found herself watching as he dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. He secured his horse and disappeared into Wilkins' store. Something about his silhouette nagged at her memory, but she pushed the thought aside. She had more pressing concerns than a strange cowboy. With a deep breath, she crossed the street and approached the red door of the Painted Lady. Her hand trembled as she raised it to knock, but before her knuckles could connect with the wood, a voice called out from behind her. "Mrs. Foster." Eliza froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, she turned to find the cowboy from the general store standing a few paces away, his hat now removed to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind but handsome in a rugged way. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, regarded her with a mixture of recognition and concern. "Excuse me," she managed, frantically trying to place him. "Eliza Foster," he said, and it wasn't a question this time. "Jeremiah's widow." She nodded cautiously, her hand instinctively reaching to smooth her hair, suddenly conscious of her appearance before this stranger who somehow knew her name. "I'm Zachary Owens," he said, taking a step forward and extending his hand. "I knew your husband briefly before the war. I was sorry to hear of his passing." The name clicked into place, the rancher Mr. Wilkins had mentioned. Eliza took his offered hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work despite his apparent wealth. "Mr. Owens," she acknowledged, "thank you for your condolences." His gaze shifted briefly to the building behind her, then back to her face. Something flickered in his expression, not judgment, but a deep understanding that made Eliza's cheeks burn with shame. "I was just on my way to," she began, but found she couldn't complete the lie. "Mrs. Foster," Zachary interrupted gently. "I don't mean to intrude on your business, but I wonder if I might have a word with you, perhaps over coffee." Eliza hesitated. The red door of the painted lady seemed to pulse behind her like a living thing, both repellent and inevitable. Yet here was an alternative, if only for a few more minutes before she had to face her decision. "That would be acceptable," she finally said. Zachary nodded and gestured toward a small cafe across the street. As they walked, Eliza was acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk who rarely saw her in the company of anyone, let alone a man of Zachary Owens' obvious means. Her dress, which had seemed adequate earlier, now felt shabby and inappropriate beside his well-made clothing. Inside the cafe, Zachary pulled out a chair for her at a corner table, far from the windows where prying eyes might observe them. He ordered coffee and, without consulting her, added a plate of eggs and biscuits to the request. "You must be hungry," he said simply when she started to protest. The food arrived, and Eliza found herself ravenous. She tried to eat with dignity, but it had been so long since she'd had a proper meal that restraint proved difficult. Zachary sipped his coffee and watched her with those perceptive blue eyes, waiting until she had eaten her fill before speaking again. "Mr. Wilkins tells me you have 3 children," he began. Eliza dabbed at her mouth with a napkin. "Yes, Sarah, Thomas, and Mary." "Fine names," he nodded. "And how are you managing, if you don't mind my asking?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Respectable people in Austin danced around such matters, offering vague sympathy but never acknowledging the harsh realities of a woman alone with 3 mouths to feed. "We're surviving," she replied carefully. Zachary leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. "Mrs. Foster, forgive my bluntness, but I saw where you were headed this morning." He nodded in the direction of the painted lady. "I don't pretend to know your circumstances in detail, but I suspect they must be dire indeed for a woman of your character to consider such a path." Eliza's spine stiffened. "You know nothing of my character, Mr. Owens." "I know Jeremiah Foster wouldn't have married a woman without it," he countered. "And I know desperate times can drive decent people to choices they'd never otherwise consider." Tears threatened, but Eliza blinked them back fiercely. She would not break down in front of this stranger, no matter how perceptive his observations. "What I do to support my family is my concern," she said, her voice low but steady. Zachary nodded slowly. "Of course, but I'd like to offer an alternative if you're willing to hear it." Eliza's hand tightened around her coffee cup. "I'm listening." "As Mr. Wilkins may have mentioned, I've recently returned to Austin and purchased a ranch north of town. The house is large, too large for a single man, and in need of proper management. I require a housekeeper, someone who can oversee the domestic affairs of the property." He paused, watching her face. "The position comes with living quarters suitable for a family, meals, and a fair wage." Eliza stared at him, searching for the catch. Men didn't make such offers without expecting something in return. As if reading her thoughts, Zachary continued, "This is a legitimate position, Mrs. Foster. Your reputation and person would be respected." You and your children would have a safe home, food on the table, and the opportunity to build a future without. His eyes flicked toward the painted lady. Compromises. Why? The question escaped before she could contain it. Why would you offer this to me? You don't know me. Zachary's expression softened slightly. I knew Jeremiah, as I said. Not well, but enough to respect him. When I returned to Austin and heard of his passing, I made inquiries about his family. He hesitated, then added more quietly, I know what it is to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. Eliza's mind raced. The offer seemed too good to be true, a way out of the corner she'd been backed into, a reprieve for her children. Yet suspicion lingered. My children would come with me. All three, of course, Zachary confirmed. There's a small cottage on the property connected to the main house but with its own entrance. It would be yours for as long as you hold the position. The children could continue their schooling. I've a wagon that makes the trip to town daily for supplies. And my duties would be managing the household, overseeing meals, keeping accounts, ensuring the house runs smoothly. I have ranch hands for the outdoor work, but the house has been neglected. It needs a woman's touch. He paused. A respectable woman's touch. Eliza took a deep breath, considering. The offer was everything she needed: security for her children, honest work, a roof over their heads. Yet leaving Austin, the only home her children had known, taking them to a ranch miles from town under the authority of a man she barely knew. I would need time, she said finally, to consider your offer and speak with my children. Zachary nodded. Of course, but... He hesitated, his eyes once again drifting toward the red door visible through the cafe window. I hope you'll consider it before exploring other options. Eliza followed his gaze and felt heat rise to her cheeks. The rent is due tomorrow, she admitted softly. We face eviction. Understanding dawned in Zachary's eyes. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a leather wallet. He counted out several bills and placed them on the table between them. An advance, he said when Eliza made no move to take the money. Should you accept the position? Pride warred with necessity as Eliza stared at the money enough to pay the rent and feed her children for weeks. I cannot accept money for work I haven't agreed to perform, she said stiffly. Zachary's mouth curved slightly. Then consider it a loan, to be repaid through service if you accept my offer, or in currency if you decline. Eliza hesitated a moment longer before slowly reaching for the bills. A loan, she agreed, tucking them securely into her pocket. Thank you, Mr. Owens. Call me Zachary, please. He finished his coffee and set the cup down with a decisive click. I'll return tomorrow to hear your decision. Shall we say noon at your home? The thought of this man seeing their shabby living conditions made Eliza uncomfortable, but she nodded. Noon would be acceptable. As they rose to leave the cafe, Zachary placed his hat back on his head. One more thing, Mrs. Foster. Whatever you decide, that, he nodded toward the painted lady, is not your only option. There are always alternatives for a woman of courage and character. With that, he tipped his hat and strode back to his waiting horse, leaving Eliza standing in the doorway of the cafe, the weight of the money in her pocket both a relief and a new kind of burden. She watched as he mounted the black stallion with easy grace, the sunlight catching on his strong profile before he urged the horse forward and disappeared down the dusty main street of Austin. For the first time in months, a flicker of hope kindled in Eliza's chest. But with it came uncertainty, and the nagging question of why a man like Zachary Owens would extend such generosity to a stranger. Experience had taught her that kindness usually came with conditions, especially from men toward women in her vulnerable position. Still, the money in her pocket meant her children would sleep under a roof tomorrow night. For today, That was enough. Eliza made her way to Mr. Halloway's office and paid the rent with Zachary's money, enduring the landlord's surprised expression and barely veiled curiosity about how she'd managed to produce the funds. Next, she visited the general store again, this time purchasing enough provisions to prepare a proper meal for her children. The remainder of the money she hid carefully in the tin box beneath her mattress. The hours until school ended passed quickly as Eliza cleaned their small home and contemplated Zachary's offer. When she collected her children, their faces lit up at the sight of the packages she carried. "Are we having a feast, Mama?" Mary asked, her small hand slipping into Eliza's. "A proper dinner," Eliza confirmed, smiling at the excitement in her youngest's eyes. That evening, as they sat around their rickety table eating a meal that, while simple, was more substantial than anything they'd had in weeks, Eliza broached the subject of potential change. "Children," she began, watching their faces carefully, "I met someone today who has offered me a position as a housekeeper on his ranch outside of town." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You mean we'd leave Austin?" "We would," Eliza confirmed. "The position comes with a cottage for us to live in. You'd continue your schooling, but you'd have open spaces to play, fresh air." "And food?" Thomas asked practically. Eliza smiled. "Yes, regular meals would be part of the arrangement." "Who is this man?" Sarah asked, her young brow furrowing with the same suspicion Eliza herself had felt. "His name is Zachary Owens. He knew your father briefly before the war." Eliza hesitated, then added, "He seems to be a decent man who is offering us a chance for a better life." "Is he married?" Sarah persisted. "No," Eliza admitted, understanding her daughter's concern. Even at 10, Sarah was aware of the precarious position of a widow in their society. "Then why does he want you specifically?" The question held the wisdom and wariness of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Eliza considered her answer carefully. "He says he respects your father's memory and wishes to help us, and he needs someone to manage his household." Mary, who had been quiet until now, looked up with wide eyes. "Will there be horses?" "I expect so, darling. It's a cattle ranch." Thomas perked up at this. "Real cowboys, ranch hands, yes." Eliza smiled at her son's enthusiasm. Sarah remained skeptical. "When do we have to decide?" "Mr. Owens is coming tomorrow at noon to hear our answer." The children exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that Eliza couldn't quite interpret. "Could we try it?" Thomas finally asked. "And if we don't like it, come back to Austin." Eliza reached across the table to squeeze his small hand. "Yes, I believe that would be possible." Sarah still looked uncertain, but she nodded slowly. "I'll help you, Mama, whatever you decide." The matter settled for the moment, they finished their meal. Later, as Eliza tucked the children into bed, she found herself studying their faces in the candlelight. Sarah, so serious and protective of her siblings. Thomas, curious and eager for adventure despite the hardships they'd endured. Little Mary, still innocent enough to find joy in simple pleasures. They deserved so much more than she had been able to provide these past months. "Mama!" Mary's sleepy voice called as Eliza turned to extinguish the candle. "Yes, darling. Is Mr. Owens a nice man?" Eliza considered the question, recalling the direct blue gaze, the lack of judgment in his eyes when he'd seen her near the painted lady, the quiet authority in his manner. "I believe he might be," she answered truthfully. "We shall see." As her children drifted to sleep, Eliza sat by the window, watching the stars appear over Austin and wondering what tomorrow would bring. The money in the tin box assured their immediate security, but Zachary Owens' offer promised something more: elusive hope for a future beyond mere survival. Morning came too quickly, bringing with it the nervous energy of anticipation. Eliza dressed with care in her blue calico, then helped the children into their best clothing. The small shack had been cleaned until it was as presentable as its worn furnishings would allow. At precisely noon, the sound of hoofbeats announced Zachary's arrival. Eliza smoothed her hands over her skirts, took a deep breath, and opened the door before he could knock. Zachary stood on the small porch, hat in hand, looking even taller and more imposing in the daylight. His gaze swept over her briefly before settling on her face with that same direct intensity she remembered from the day before. "Mrs. Foster," he greeted her with a slight nod. "Mr. Owens," she returned. "Please come in." She stepped aside, allowing him to enter the small space that suddenly seemed even more cramped in his presence. The children had arranged themselves by the table, standing straight with expressions ranging from Sarah's wary assessment to Mary's open curiosity. "These are my children," Eliza said. "Sarah, Thomas, and Mary." Zachary inclined his head to each in turn. "Miss Sarah, Master Thomas, Miss Mary, it's a pleasure to meet you." Thomas stepped forward, his small chest puffed out importantly. "Are you really a rancher, sir?" A smile touched Zachary's lips, softening the hard lines of his face. "I am indeed. The Rocking Z has 300 head of cattle and some of the finest horses in Travis County." Thomas's eyes widened appreciatively. 300. "And growing," Zachary confirmed, before turning his attention to Sarah, who was watching him with undisguised scrutiny. "You have questions for me, Miss Sarah?" The girl glanced at her mother, then straightened her shoulders. "Why do you want my mother to work for you?" Eliza started to intervene, but Zachary held up a hand. "It's a fair question," he said. "I need someone capable and trustworthy to manage my household. Your mother comes highly recommended as both." "By whom?" Sarah challenged. "Sarah," Eliza admonished gently, but Zachary didn't seem offended. "By Mr. Wilkins at the general store, by Mrs. Peterson at the school, and by my own judgment," he answered evenly. "A woman who has kept her family together through hardship demonstrates exactly the qualities I need." Sarah considered this, then asked, "Would we have our own rooms?" "The cottage has 2 bedrooms," Zachary replied. "Not large, but clean and well built. There's a small kitchen, a sitting room, and access to the main house through a covered walkway." He glanced at Eliza. "You would have privacy when not working, and the children would have the run of the ranch grounds, within reasonable safety limits, of course. Are there other children?" This came from Mary, who had edged closer during the exchange. Zachary shook his head. "Not at present, though my foreman, Manuel, has family in the area who visit occasionally. His niece is about your age, I believe." Eliza watched as Zachary answered each of her children's questions with patience and straightforward honesty. He didn't speak down to them or dismiss their concerns, and gradually, even Sarah's rigid posture relaxed slightly. When the children's curiosity was satisfied, Zachary turned to Eliza. "And you, Mrs. Foster, have you reached a decision?" Eliza took a deep breath, looking at each of her children's faces before meeting Zachary's steady gaze. "We would like to accept your offer, Mr. Owens, on a trial basis if that's acceptable." Something like satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "Perfectly acceptable. Shall we say 3 months? By then, we'll both know if the arrangement suits." 3 months, Eliza agreed. "Excellent." Zachary settled his hat back on his head. "I have business in town today, but I'll return tomorrow morning with the wagon to collect you and your belongings. Is that sufficient time to prepare?" Eliza glanced around the small room. They had few possessions worth taking, and fewer ties to Austin beyond the children's school and the grave on the outskirts of town where Jeremiah lay. "It is," she confirmed. "Until tomorrow, then." Zachary nodded to each of them in turn before stepping back onto the porch. As he turned to leave, he paused. "Mrs. Foster, should you require additional funds for any necessary purchases before our departure, please don't hesitate to ask." Pride made her want to refuse, but practicality won out. "Thank you, Mr. Owens. I believe we have what we need." With a final nod, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the Foster family standing in the doorway watching his retreating figure. "He's very tall," Mary observed. "And rich," Thomas added with boyish admiration. Sarah slipped her hand into Eliza's. "Are we really going, Mama?" Eliza squeezed her daughter's fingers reassuringly. "Yes, Sarah, we're going to try for a better life." The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity as Eliza sorted through their meager possessions, packing what they would take and disposing of what they would leave behind. She visited the school to inform Mrs. Peterson of their departure, enduring the teacher's barely concealed surprise and pointed questions about her new employer. In the afternoon, she led the children to the small cemetery where a simple wooden cross marked Jeremiah's grave. As they stood together in the warm spring sunshine, Eliza felt a curious mixture of guilt and relief. "Your papa would want us to be safe and cared for," she told the children softly. "He'd understand why we have to go." Sarah placed the wildflowers they had gathered on the grave. "Will we ever come back to visit him?" "Of course," Eliza promised, "and we'll carry him in our hearts wherever we go." That night, as the children slept for the last time on their shared mattress in Austin, Eliza sat by the window once more. Tomorrow would bring a new chapter in their lives, one filled with uncertainties, but also possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine just days before. "Give me strength, Jeremiah," she whispered to the stars. "And forgive me for what I almost did." The morning dawned clear and mild, a perfect day for beginnings. Eliza had the children dressed and their few bundles packed before the sun was fully above the horizon. They ate a simple breakfast, their excitement and nervousness filling the small shack with an energy it hadn't known in months. The sound of a wagon approaching brought them all to attention. Eliza smoothed her hair and straightened her collar before opening the door to greet Zachary. He wasn't alone. A younger man sat beside him on the wagon seat, his complexion darker and his features marking him as Mexican or perhaps mixed heritage. "Mrs. Foster," Zachary greeted her, jumping down from the wagon. "This is Manuel Diaz, my foreman and right-hand man. He'll be helping with your belongings." Manuel tipped his hat with a friendly smile. "Señora Foster, niños, welcome to the Rocking Z family." The word family caught Eliza off guard, but she returned his smile and introduced her children. Within minutes, their bundles were loaded into the wagon, and Eliza took one last look at the place that had been their home for the past 3 years, first with Jeremiah, then without him. "Ready?" Zachary asked quietly, appearing at her elbow. Eliza nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. He guided her to the wagon with a gentle hand at her back, helping her up beside Manuel, while he lifted the children into the wagon bed where they could sit among the supplies and bundles. As the wagon pulled away from the small shack, Eliza felt Sarah's hand slip into hers. She glanced back at her daughter's solemn face and managed a reassuring smile. "An adventure, remember." The journey to the Rocking Z took most of the morning, the road winding north out of Austin through rolling hills that gradually gave way to more open rangeland. Manuel kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling stories that soon had even Sarah giggling. Zachary rode alongside the wagon on his black stallion, occasionally joining the conversation but more often silent, his eyes scanning the horizon with the watchfulness of a man accustomed to responsibility. It was nearly noon when Manuel announced, "Just over that rise you'll see the ranch house." Eliza leaned forward expectantly as the wagon crested the hill and gasped at the vista that spread before them. A broad valley stretched out below, bisected by a winding creek lined with cottonwoods and willows. Nestled among the trees was a sprawling ranch house, 2 stories of weathered wood and stone with a wide veranda wrapping around its front. Nearby stood a large barn, corrals, and several smaller outbuildings, while in the distance, cattle dotted the green pastures. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Zachary had drawn his horse up beside the wagon, and she turned to find him watching her reaction with that same intense blue gaze. "It still needs work," he said, "but it has potential." As they descended into the valley, Eliza could see that he was right. Though impressive from a distance, up close the ranch house showed signs of neglect: peeling paint, missing shingles, a general air of disuse. Still, its bones were sound, and she could envision what it might become with proper care. Manuel drove the wagon right up to the front of the house, where a Mexican woman waited on the veranda, wiping her hands on her apron. "My wife, Lucia," Manuel explained as he set the brake. "She has been helping with the cooking since the boss returned, but she will be pleased to have another woman to talk to." Lucia hurried down the steps to greet them, her round face wreathed in smiles. "Bienvenidos, welcome to Rocking Z." She embraced Eliza warmly, as if they were old friends rather than strangers. "The children, they must be hungry after the long ride. Come inside. I have made a special lunch to welcome you." The children, shy at first, were quickly won over by Lucia's motherly attention and the promise of food. They followed her into the house while Manuel began unloading their belongings. Zachary dismounted and handed the reins of his horse to a young stable hand who had appeared from the direction of the barn. "I'll show you around after you've eaten," he told Eliza, his manner more formal now that they were on his territory. "The cottage is through there," he pointed to a covered walkway extending from the side of the main house. "But Lucia has prepared lunch in the dining room." Eliza nodded, suddenly aware of the enormity of the change they were making. Yesterday, they had been struggling to survive in a one-room shack. Today, they were guests at a prosperous ranch, about to sit down to a meal prepared in their honor. The main house was as impressive inside as out, with high ceilings, polished wood floors, and large windows that filled the rooms with light. The furnishings were sparse but of good quality, though Eliza noted the layer of dust on many surfaces and the general air of bachelor neglect throughout. The dining room, at least, had been thoroughly cleaned for their arrival. A large oak table dominated the space, set with china that, while not fancy, was certainly a step above the chipped pottery they were accustomed to at home. Lunch was a festive affair, with Lucia bustling about serving a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and a sweet custard that had Mary's eyes widening with delight. Manuel joined them, keeping up his cheerful conversation, while Zachary sat at the head of the table, mostly silent but observant. Eliza noticed that despite his quiet demeanor, nothing escaped Zachary's attention. He noted when Thomas's glass needed refilling before the boy himself realized it, saw Mary struggling to cut her meat and wordlessly reached over to assist her, recognized Sarah's hesitancy, and engaged her in conversation about the books she was studying in school. When the meal concluded, Lucia shooed the children outside with promises of showing them the new kittens in the barn, while Manuel excused himself to attend to ranch business. Eliza found herself alone with Zachary for the first time since their meeting in Austin. "I hope everything meets with your approval so far," he said, rising from his chair. "It's more than generous. Eliza replied honestly. "I'm not certain I understand why you're doing all this for us." Zachary's expression remained impassive. "I told you I need a housekeeper. You need a position and a home for your family. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." There was more to it than that. Eliza was certain, but she didn't press. Instead, she asked, "When would you like me to begin my duties?" "Tomorrow will be soon enough," he replied. "Today, settle into the cottage and rest from your journey. I'll show you around now if you're ready." Eliza nodded, and Zachary led her through the house, pointing out the various rooms and explaining the routine of the ranch. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, but in need of organization. The parlor contained a fine piano that hadn't been played in years. Upstairs were 5 bedrooms, including Zachary's at the end of the hall, and a small library filled with books that made Eliza's fingers itch to explore them. "You and the children are welcome to borrow any books that interest you," Zachary said, noticing her lingering gaze on the shelves. "I'm not much of a reader myself these days, but I remember you were always fond of poetry." Eliza looked at him sharply. "How would you know that?" A slight flush colored Zachary's weathered cheeks. "Jeremiah mentioned it once when we were discussing literature. He was proud of having a wife who appreciated Wordsworth and Keats." The mention of her late husband's name sent a pang through Eliza's heart. "Yes, he indulged my love of poetry, though he preferred more practical reading himself. There are agricultural journals and newspapers in the study downstairs, if you're interested." Zachary moved toward the door. "Shall we continue?" The tour concluded at the covered walkway that led to the cottage. It was a charming structure, smaller than the main house but far more spacious than their shack in Austin had been. True to Zachary's word, it contained 2 bedrooms, a cozy sitting room, and a small but functional kitchen. "You'll take most meals with us in the main house, of course," Zachary explained, "but I thought you might appreciate the option of privacy sometimes." Their bundles had been placed in the sitting room, and Eliza could see that someone, likely Lucia, had filled a vase with wildflowers and set it on the small table by the window. "It's perfect," she said softly. "The children will be thrilled. I'm glad." Zachary's voice had lost some of its formality. "Mrs. Foster, Eliza, I want you and your children to feel at home here. The rocking Z may be my property, but I hope it will become a place where all of you can heal and build new memories." The sincerity in his voice caught Eliza off guard. She looked up at him, really studying his face for the first time. Beneath the weathered exterior and reserved manner, she glimpsed something unexpected, a loneliness that mirrored her own. "Thank you," she said simply. "We'll do our best to make this work." Zachary nodded, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had appeared. "I'll leave you to settle in. Supper is at 6 in the main house. Until then, consider yourself free to explore the ranch within safe boundaries, of course. Manuel or Lucia can direct you." With that, he departed, leaving Eliza alone in the cottage that was to be their new home. She walked slowly from room to room, marveling at the solid construction, the clean linens on the beds, the small but thoughtful touches that suggested preparation for their arrival. In what was to be the children's bedroom, she found 3 beds, not cots or pallets, but real beds with frames and mattresses filled with fresh straw. A wooden chest stood at the foot of each bed, and a curtain had been hung to create a separate space for Sarah as she approached womanhood. In the second bedroom, her bedroom, Eliza discovered a proper dresser with a mirror, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a bed wide enough that she wouldn't have to curl into a ball to fit on it, as she had in Austin. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the quilt that covered it. Clean, whole, and brightly colored, it was a far cry from the threadbare blankets they had used in the shack. For the first time since Jeremiah's death, Eliza allowed herself to weep not from despair, but from relief and overwhelming gratitude that her children would sleep warm and safe tonight. When the tears subsided, she washed her face in the basin and went to find her children, determined that this new beginning would be marked with joy rather than uncertainty. She found them in the barn with Lucia, exactly as promised, playing with a litter of kittens while the mother cat watched indulgently from a nearby hay bale. "Mama," Mary cried when she spotted Eliza. "Look at the babies. Can we keep one, please?" Eliza glanced at Lucia, who smiled and nodded. "The boss, he says the barn cats keep the mice away from the grain, but they make good pets too. Your little one can choose one when they are old enough to leave their mama. We have our own rooms," Thomas announced, rushing to Eliza's side. "Lucia showed us the cottage. I have a bed all to myself." "And a chest for your clothes," Eliza confirmed, stroking his hair. "Have you seen the creek yet? Perhaps we could explore a little before supper." The afternoon passed pleasantly as they familiarized themselves with their new surroundings. The children were fascinated by everything: the horses in the corral, the chickens in the yard, the vast expanse of land that stretched in every direction. Even Sarah's reserve melted as she discovered a swing hanging from one of the cottonwoods by the creek. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Eliza gathered her brood and returned to the cottage to freshen up for supper. They changed into clean clothes, the same ones they had worn to church in Austin, their only truly presentable attire, and made their way to the main house. Supper was a less formal affair than lunch had been, with ranch hands joining them at the long table. Zachary introduced each man by name, and Eliza did her best to commit them to memory, knowing she would be responsible for feeding them all in the days to come. After the meal, as darkness fell, Lucia escorted the children back to the cottage while Eliza remained behind to discuss her duties with Zachary. In his study, a masculine room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk, he outlined his expectations. "The household accounts need organizing," he explained, showing her a ledger filled with hastily scribbled entries. "Meals for the men, ordering supplies, managing the domestic staff, though at present, that's just Lucia and yourself. And cleaning," Eliza added, noting the layer of dust on the bookshelves. Zachary looked almost embarrassed. "Yes, the house has been neglected. I've been more focused on getting the ranch operations in order." "It's a beautiful home," Eliza assured him. "It just needs some attention." "Like many things," he said quietly, and Eliza had the distinct impression he was referring to more than just the house. As she turned to leave, a question that had been nagging at her since their first meeting finally found voice. "Mr. Owens, Zachary," he corrected. "Zachary," she amended. "You said yesterday that you know what it is to lose everything and rebuild from nothing. What did you mean?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. His face took on that closed expression she was beginning to recognize as his way of maintaining distance. But then he sighed and gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs by the cold fireplace. "I lost my wife and son during the war," he said without preamble. "Emily and little Zachary Jr. Cholera swept through our town while I was away fighting. By the time I returned, they were both gone." Eliza's heart contracted with sympathy. "I'm so sorry." Zachary nodded, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. "When the war ended, I couldn't bear to stay in Texas. Too many memories. So I went west to California, worked cattle drives, saved every penny. Eventually bought my own small spread, then a larger one. Built a successful operation." He paused, "but it never felt like home." "So you came back," Eliza said softly. "After 15 years, yes." His blue eyes finally met hers. "Sometimes running from pain only prolongs it." I decided it was time to face mine and make peace with the past. The revelation of this shared grief between them shifted something in Eliza's perception of the stern, reserved rancher. Like her, he had endured loss. Unlike her, he had found a way to forge a new life from the ashes of the old. "Thank you for telling me," she said, "and for giving my family this opportunity." Zachary's expression softened slightly. "Perhaps we can help each other heal, Mrs. Foster." "Eliza," she corrected with a small smile, "if I'm to call you Zachary." For the first time since they'd met, Zachary smiled fully, transforming his face from handsome but severe to something approaching boyish charm. "Eliza it is, then." That night, as Eliza lay in her new bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind in the cottonwoods, the soft breathing of her children from the next room, she found herself thinking of Zachary Owens. Not as her employer, but as a man who, like her, carried the weight of grief yet continued to move forward. "Perhaps we can help each other heal." She whispered his words into the darkness, allowing herself, for the first time in many months, to feel the stirring of something beyond mere survival, a tentative hope for what the future might hold. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm at the rocking Z. Eliza rose with the sun each morning, prepared breakfast for the household with Lucia's help, and spent her days gradually transforming the ranch house from a bachelor's neglected dwelling into a proper home. The children adapted quickly to their new surroundings. Thomas followed Manuel around whenever permitted, absorbing knowledge about horses and cattle with an eagerness that amused the ranch hands. Mary made friends with the kittens and chickens, her previously pinched face rounding out as regular meals and fresh air worked their magic. Even Sarah, initially the most reluctant to embrace their new circumstances, found joy in helping Eliza with household tasks and spending hours in the library devouring books she'd never had access to before. Zachary remained something of an enigma. He was unfailingly polite, even kind in his own reserved way, but he maintained a careful distance, leaving the ranch for days at a time on business and keeping to himself when in residence. Still, Eliza occasionally caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, and something in his gaze made her heart beat a little faster. One morning in late May, as Eliza was supervising the cleaning of the parlor, she discovered the piano was badly out of tune. She mentioned it to Zachary at lunch, suggesting they might arrange for a tuner from Austin to visit. "You play?" he asked, looking up from his plate with interest. "I did once," she admitted. "My mother taught me as a girl. I haven't had the opportunity in years." That afternoon, a messenger was dispatched to Austin. 2 days later, an elderly German man arrived in a wagon, his tools carefully packed in a wooden case. By evening, the piano was restored to its former glory, its notes ringing true and clear through the house. After the children were asleep, Eliza returned to the parlor, drawn by the instrument's siren call. The house was quiet. The ranch hands retired to the bunkhouse, and she assumed Zachary was in his study as usual. She sat at the piano bench, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them, reacquainting herself with their feel. Finally, she began to play hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as muscle memory took over. The piece was one her mother had taught her, a simple nocturne that spoke of moonlight and gentle breezes. As the last notes faded, a voice from the doorway startled her. "Beautiful," Zachary said softly. "Please don't stop on my account." Eliza's hand stilled on the keys. "I thought I was alone." "I hope I didn't disturb you." Zachary stepped into the room, the lamplight casting shadows across his features. "Not at all. Emily used to play in the evenings too. I'd forgotten how much I missed the sound of music in the house." The mention of his late wife created an intimacy between them, an acknowledgement of shared loss that transcended their employer-employee relationship. "Would you like me to continue?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zachary nodded, settling into an armchair near the piano. "Please." She played for nearly an hour, pieces from memory and simple improvisations when her recollection failed. Zachary listened with his eyes closed, occasionally nodding in appreciation or smiling at a particularly lovely passage. When she finally concluded, her fingers stiff from the unaccustomed exercise, he opened his eyes and regarded her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "Thank you," he said simply. "That was a gift I didn't know I needed." Eliza felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "It's I who should thank you, for the piano, for having it tuned." Zachary rose from his chair and crossed to stand beside the piano, his tall frame casting a shadow over the keys. "Music brings life to a home. This place has been silent too long." "It's becoming less so," Eliza observed with a small smile. Between Mary's laughter, Thomas's endless questions, and now this piano, silence is becoming a rare commodity at the Rocking Z. "A welcome change," Zachary said, his voice low and rich in the quiet room. "Eliza." The sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. "Yes." Before he could continue, the sound of small feet padding down the hallway interrupted them. Mary appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep, her nightgown trailing behind her. "Mama, I had a bad dream," she said, rubbing her eyes. Zachary stepped back immediately, putting a respectable distance between himself and Eliza. "I should retire," he said. "Good night, Mrs. Foster." "Miss Mary." As he passed Mary, he knelt briefly to her level. "Dreams can't hurt you, little one, especially not with your mother watching over you." Mary nodded solemnly, and Zachary continued on his way, his footsteps echoing down the hallway toward his study. Eliza gathered her daughter into her arms, trying to ignore the lingering warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with maternal affection, and everything to do with the way Zachary had looked at her in the lamplight. The following weeks brought changes to the ranch and its inhabitants. June bloomed hot and bright, the creek running lower as the Texas summer took hold. Eliza settled fully into her role as housekeeper, finding satisfaction in bringing order and comfort to the sprawling ranch house. The ledgers were meticulously kept, meals appeared on time, and dust no longer gathered on unused surfaces. More significantly, the atmosphere of the house changed. Where once it had been merely a place for Zachary to eat and sleep between long days of ranch work, it gradually became a home. Wildflowers appeared in vases throughout the rooms. The aroma of baking bread and simmering stews replaced the stale emptiness. In the evenings, piano music often drifted through the open windows, sometimes accompanied by the children's voices as Eliza taught them simple songs. Zachary, too, began to change. His absences grew shorter and less frequent. He took to joining Eliza and the children for evening walks by the creek, teaching Thomas to skip stones across the water and showing Sarah how to identify the constellations in the night sky. His smiles came more readily, the severe lines of his face softening when Mary climbed unabashedly into his lap with a book she wanted him to read. One particularly hot afternoon in late June, Eliza was in the kitchen preparing preserves from the wild berries the children had gathered when she heard shouts from the direction of the corral. Setting aside her work, she hurried outside to see several ranch hands gathered around something on the ground, their faces grim. "What's happened?" she called, hurrying toward them. Manuel turned, his expression somber. "The boss," he said. "A new horse, very spirited. He was thrown badly." Eliza's heart lurched as the men parted to reveal Zachary lying motionless in the dust, his face pale beneath his tan. "Has someone gone for the doctor?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "Miguel left for town 5 minutes ago," Manuel confirmed, "but it will be hours before he returns with Dr. Wilson." Zachary's eyelids fluttered and he groaned, attempting to sit up. "I'm fine," he muttered. "Just had the wind knocked out of me." "Don't move," Eliza ordered, placing a restraining hand on his chest. "You might have broken something." With Manuel's help, they managed to get Zachary into the house and onto the sofa in the parlor. A cursory examination revealed no obvious broken bones, but a nasty gash on his forehead and what promised to be spectacular bruising across his torso. "The children," Zachary began, wincing as Eliza cleaned the cut on his head, "are with Lucia at the creek," she assured him. "They won't see you like this." "Always thinking of others," he murmured, his blue eyes fixed on her face despite the pain evident in his expression. "Even when I'm the fool who tried to break a half-wild stallion at my age." "Hush," Eliza scolded gently. "You're hardly ancient, Mr. Owens." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Back to Mr. Owens, am I? I must look truly pathetic." Despite her concern, Eliza found herself smiling back. "Zachary, then. And you look like a man who's had a bad fall and needs to rest until the doctor arrives." "Will you stay?" he asked, his voice suddenly vulnerable in a way she'd never heard before. "I find I don't much like being alone when I'm injured." Eliza nodded, settling into a chair beside the sofa. "Of course." As the afternoon wore on, Zachary drifted in and out of sleep while Eliza kept vigil. During one wakeful period, he began to speak of his life in California, not the business aspects he'd mentioned before, but the personal struggles of rebuilding a life shattered by loss. "The ranch there was successful," he said, his voice low and reflective, "but empty. No matter how many men I employed, how many cattle I acquired, at the end of the day, I returned to silence." "Is that why you came back to Texas?" Eliza asked. Zachary was quiet for so long she thought he might have drifted off again. "Finally," he said, "partly. And partly because I realized I was hiding, from memories, from the possibility of caring for anyone again." He turned his head slightly to look at her. "Fear is a prison, Eliza, one I lived in for 15 years. The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep within her. "I understand that prison," she said softly. "After Jeremiah died, I was so afraid, of failing the children, of not being enough of." She hesitated, then admitted, "of being alone for the rest of my life." Zachary's hand moved across the space between them, finding hers where it rested on the edge of the sofa. His touch was warm and surprisingly gentle for a man who worked with his hands. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "None of us are." Before Eliza could respond to this declaration, the sound of a wagon approaching announced the doctor's arrival. She withdrew her hand reluctantly and rose to greet Dr. Wilson at the door. The doctor's examination confirmed what Eliza had suspected: no broken bones, but significant bruising and a mild concussion that would require rest for the next few days. He left medicine for pain and instructions for Zachary to avoid strenuous activity, which the rancher received with poor grace. "I have a ranch to run," he protested as the doctor packed his bag. "You have capable men to run it for a few days," Dr. Wilson countered, "and Mrs. Foster here to ensure you follow orders." After the doctor departed, Eliza helped Zachary to his bedroom, supporting his weight as he navigated the stairs. The room, like the man himself, was a study in contrasts, functional and somewhat austere, yet with unexpected touches of refinement. A hand-carved dresser stood against one wall, a landscape painting of a mountain valley hung above it, and a worn Bible rested on the bedside table. "I can manage from here," Zachary said as they reached the bed, a hint of embarrassment coloring his voice. Eliza nodded, understanding his pride. "I'll bring up some broth later," and the medicine Dr. Wilson left. As she turned to leave, Zachary caught her hand. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough with emotion or pain, perhaps both, "thank you for everything." She squeezed his fingers briefly before releasing them. "Rest now," she said softly. For the next 3 days, Zachary was confined to his bed or the sofa in the parlor, chafing against the inactivity but secretly enjoying the attention lavished on him by Eliza and the children. Mary appointed herself his special nurse, bringing him wildflowers and insisting on reading to him from her primer. Thomas kept him informed of ranch activities, acting as messenger between Zachary and Manuel. Even Sarah thawed completely, engaging him in discussions about the books she was reading and asking thoughtful questions about his life before the rocking Z. On the 4th day, Dr. Wilson declared Zachary fit for light duties, and life at the ranch began to return to normal. But something had shifted between Zachary and Eliza during those days of enforced proximity. The careful distance he had maintained dissolved, replaced by a quiet intimacy that manifested in small ways, their hands brushing as they reached for the same dish at dinner, the way his eyes sought hers across a room, the conversations that stretched late into the evening after the children were asleep. July arrived with sweltering heat and the promise of Independence Day celebrations. The town of Austin was planning a special picnic and dance to mark the occasion, and excitement ran high among the ranch hands and children alike. "Will we go to the celebration, Mama?" Sarah asked at breakfast one morning, her eyes bright with anticipation. Before Eliza could respond, Zachary cleared his throat. "I was thinking we might all attend," he said, addressing Eliza rather than the children. "If you're amenable." "All of us," Eliza clarified. "Together." Zachary nodded, a slight flush visible beneath his tan. "As a household," he said carefully, though something in his eyes suggested he might have preferred a different word. The children's enthusiasm made refusal impossible, even had Eliza been inclined to decline. "That would be lovely," she agreed, ignoring the knowing look Lucia exchanged with Manuel across the table. The day of the celebration dawned clear and hot. Eliza rose early to prepare, pressing her best dress and helping Sarah style her hair in a more grown-up fashion. Thomas and Mary were scrubbed until they shone, their excitement rendering them nearly unmanageable as they waited for the wagon to be readied. When Eliza finally emerged from the cottage with the children in tow, she found Zachary waiting by a buggy rather than the usual wagon. He had traded his work clothes for a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and clean trousers. His hair was neatly combed and he had trimmed his beard. The overall effect was striking enough to make Eliza falter momentarily in her steps. "You look very fine today," she managed, feeling suddenly self-conscious in her simple blue dress, the same one she had worn the day they met, though now freshly laundered and mended. "As do you," Zachary replied, his eyes lingering on her face in a way that made her cheeks warm. "Blue suits you, Eliza." The journey to Austin was filled with the children's chatter and excitement. Zachary drove the buggy himself, with Eliza beside him and the children wedged in the back seat. Several times during the drive, Eliza caught him glancing at her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. The town was transformed for the celebration. Flags and bunting decorated the main street, tables laden with food filled the town square, and a makeshift stage had been erected for speeches and later, a band for dancing. Many familiar faces greeted them as they arrived: shopkeepers, former neighbors, parents of children who had attended school with Sarah and Thomas. Eliza noticed the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed their group. No doubt the sight of the widow Foster arriving with the prosperous rancher, Zachary Owens, was fodder for town gossip. But for once, she found she didn't mind the attention. Let them talk. She and her children were healthy, well-fed, and happy, a far cry from the desperate woman who had stood outside the Painted Lady just months ago. The day passed pleasantly with food, games for the children, and patriotic speeches that Zachary endured with stoic patience. As evening approached, lanterns were lit around the square and the band began to play. Couples moved onto the open area that served as a dance floor, while others gathered in groups to watch and socialize. Eliza sat with Mary dozing against her shoulder, watching as Sarah tentatively joined a group of girls her age and Thomas engaged in an impromptu race with several boys around the edge of the square. She had lost track of Zachary some time ago when he'd been cornered by a group of ranchers eager to discuss cattle prices and breeding stock. "May I have this dance?" The deep voice beside her made Eliza look up with a start. Zachary stood there, hand extended, an uncertain smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm afraid I can't," Eliza replied, nodding toward Mary's sleeping form. "Allow me." Lucia appeared as if summoned, gently lifting Mary from Eliza's arms. "The Nina will sleep just as well on my lap, and you should enjoy yourself, Senora Eliza." With her excuse removed, Eliza hesitantly placed her hand in Zachary's and allowed him to lead her to the dance floor. It had been years since she had danced, not since before Jeremiah's death, and she felt awkward and unsure as Zachary's arm circled her waist with proper formality. "I may step on your toes," she warned him. "I'm out of practice." Zachary's smile deepened. "I'll risk it." As they began to move to the music, Eliza's initial stiffness gradually gave way to remembered grace. Zachary was a surprisingly good dancer, leading with confidence, but without the overbearing control some men exhibited on the dance floor. "You dance well for a rancher," she observed, relaxing into the rhythm. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," Zachary replied. "She said no son of hers would embarrass a lady by shuffling like a bear with sore paws." The image made Eliza laugh, the sound light and free in a way she hadn't experienced in too long. Zachary's eyes warmed at the sound, and his arm tightened slightly around her waist. "You should laugh more often," he said quietly. "It suits you." The intimacy of the moment, of being held in his arms with the music swirling around them and the stars emerging in the twilight sky above, made Eliza bold. "I find I have more reason to laugh these days," she admitted. Zachary's gaze held hers, the blue of his eyes deepening with an emotion she dared not name. "Eliza," he began, his voice low and serious, "there's something I've been wanting to tell you, well, if it ain't the widow Foster, looking mighty cozy with her new provider." The sneering voice cut through their moment like a knife. Eliza turned to see Thaddeus Holloway, her former landlord, watching them with a malicious smile. He was clearly in his cups, swaying slightly as he approached. "Evening, Holloway," Zachary said coolly, his arm still around Eliza's waist in what now felt like a protective gesture. Holloway ignored him, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Eliza. "Didn't take you long to find a replacement for Jeremiah, did it? Though I reckon old Zachary here got a better deal than what you were offering behind the Painted Lady that day." Eliza felt as if she'd been doused with ice water. The shame she thought she'd left behind in Austin rushed back, burning her cheeks and closing her throat. Beside her, she felt Zachary go rigid. "You're drunk, Holloway," Zachary said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Go sleep it off before you say something you'll regret." Holloway snorted. "What's to regret? Just speaking God's truth." Ask anyone in town what the widow Foster was about to do before you swooped in and saved her. Ask them what kind of woman. He never finished the sentence. Zachary's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling into the dust. A collective gasp went up from those nearby, the music faltering as all eyes turned toward the commotion. "Zachary!" Eliza clutched at his arm, horrified. "Stop, please!" Zachary stood over Holloway, his chest heaving with rage, but he made no move to strike again. "Apologize to the lady," he commanded. Holloway rubbed his jaw, malice still gleaming in his eyes. "Truth don't require apologies, Owens." Zachary took a step forward, but Eliza placed herself between the two men. "Enough," she said firmly. "This solves nothing." She turned to Holloway with all the dignity she could muster. "Mr. Holloway, you are entitled to your opinion of me, however misinformed it may be, but I would appreciate it if you would express it elsewhere, away from my children." The mention of the children seemed to penetrate even Holloway's alcohol-addled brain. He glanced toward where Sarah stood with her friends, watching the scene with wide, frightened eyes, and had the grace to look momentarily ashamed. "Come on, Thad," another man said, helping Holloway to his feet. "Let's get you home." As they led him away, Eliza became aware that they were still the center of attention. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and she could imagine all too well what was being said. The humiliation was overwhelming. "I need to go," she said to Zachary, her voice barely audible. "The children, of course," Zachary agreed immediately. "I'll get the buggy." The ride back to the rocking Z was silent and tense. The children, sensing the adults' discomfort but not understanding its cause, were subdued. Mary fell asleep again almost immediately, while Thomas stared out at the darkened landscape, and Sarah sat rigid and watchful beside him. When they arrived at the ranch, Eliza helped the children to bed in silence, promising Sarah they would talk in the morning. Then, unable to face Zachary and the questions she was sure he must have, she retreated to her own room and closed the door firmly. Sleep eluded her as she relived the humiliation of the evening. Holloway's accusations had been public and devastating, not just for her but potentially for her children as well. How long before the whispers reached Sarah's ears? How long before Thomas had to defend his mother's honor in the schoolyard? And Zachary, what must he think of her now? The truth of how close she had come to selling herself had been laid bare for all to see, including the man who had rescued her from that fate. The shame of it burned anew, and Eliza buried her face in her pillow to muffle her sobs. A soft knock at her door sometime later startled her. She sat up, hastily wiping her face with the edge of her nightgown. "Who is it?" she called softly. "Zachary," came the reply. "May I speak with you, Eliza?" She hesitated, then rose to open the door a crack. Zachary stood in the hallway, still dressed as he had been at the celebration, though his collar was unbuttoned and his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. "The children are asleep," she said, not opening the door further. "I know. I checked on them." He paused, studying her face in the dim light. "You've been crying." It wasn't a question, so Eliza didn't bother to deny it. "It's been a difficult evening." "Holloway is a drunk and a fool," Zachary said firmly. "No one with any sense will give credence to his ramblings." "But they're true, aren't they?" The words escaped before Eliza could stop them. "I was exactly where he said I was, about to do exactly what he implied. If you hadn't come along that day, if I hadn't come along, you would have found another way," Zachary interrupted. "Because you're a mother who would do anything to protect her children. There's no shame in that, Eliza." The gentleness in his voice undid her. Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "I was desperate," she whispered. "So desperate that I was willing to stop." Zachary placed his hand over hers where it gripped the door frame. Whatever you were considering, whatever might have happened, it didn't. You're here now, safe, respected. Eliza shook her head. How can you say that after tonight? The whole town was watching. They'll all know or suspect. The children will hear whispers, questions. Then we'll face that together, Zachary said firmly. Eliza, look at me. She raised her eyes reluctantly to meet his steady gaze. I don't care what Holloway or anyone else in town thinks or says. I know who you are, a woman of extraordinary courage and dignity, a devoted mother, He hesitated, then continued more softly, a woman I've come to care for very deeply. Eliza's heart stuttered at the declaration. Zachary, you don't have to say anything, he assured her quickly. It's not why I came to your door tonight. I just couldn't bear the thought of you believing, even for a moment, that what happened tonight changed how I see you. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Eliza felt something within her unclench, a tight knot of shame and fear that had been with her since Jeremiah's death beginning to loosen. Thank you, she said softly. Zachary's thumb brushed over her knuckles in a gentle caress. Try to sleep, Eliza. Things will look better in the morning. He released her hand and stepped back, turning to go. Before he could take more than a step, Eliza found herself speaking again. Zachary, she called softly. When he turned back, she said, I've come to care for you too. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the hills, gradual at first, then radiant with joy. He didn't speak, just nodded once before continuing down the hallway to his own room. Eliza closed her door and leaned against it, her heart pounding with the enormity of what had just passed between them. For the first time since Jeremiah's death, she had admitted to feelings for another man, and not just any man, but her employer, her protector, the person who had quite literally saved her from the brink of desperation. Sleep came eventually, and with it dreams not of shame and humiliation, but of blue eyes and gentle hands and possibilities she had thought forever beyond her reach. Morning brought with it the necessity of addressing what had happened with the children. Sarah, at least, had witnessed enough to have questions. Eliza gathered them after breakfast, taking them to the cottage where they could speak privately. Something happened at the celebration last night, she began, choosing her words carefully. A man said some unkind things about me, and Mr. Owens' Zachary defended me. Is that why he hit that man? Thomas asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of concern and admiration. Eliza nodded reluctantly. Yes, although violence is never the best solution to a problem. What did the man say, Mama? Sarah asked, her young face solemn. Eliza took a deep breath. He implied that after your father died, when things were very difficult for us, I might have done something improper to earn money. Sarah's brow furrowed. Did you? No, Eliza said firmly. But I considered it, Sarah. I was desperate, with no money for rent or food and few options available to a woman alone. She reached for her daughter's hands. I want you to understand that sometimes in life, we face terrible choices. What matters is not that we contemplate them in our darkest moments, but the choices we ultimately make. Sarah absorbed this with the precocious gravity that sometimes made Eliza's heart ache. And you chose to come here instead, she said, to work for Mr. Owens. Yes, Eliza confirmed. Zachary offered me honest work and a safe home for all of us. And now he likes you, Mary piped up, startling Eliza. Like a sweetheart, Thomas made a face. You, Mary, don't be stupid. It's not stupid, Mary insisted. I saw him looking at Mama like Papa used to. And he danced with her at the celebration. Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks, out of the mouths of babes. Zachary and I have become friends, she said carefully. We respect and care about each other. Sarah was watching her closely. Do you like him too, Mama, like a sweetheart? The direct question deserved an honest answer. I'm beginning to, Eliza admitted. But my first concern will always be you three. How would you feel if Zachary and I became closer? The children exchanged glances, one of those silent communications that often passed between siblings. It was Thomas who spoke first. I think it'd be swell, he said earnestly. Zachary teaches me about horses and cattle, and he doesn't mind when I ask lots of questions. And he makes you smile, Mama. You didn't smile much in Austin. Mary nodded vigorously. He reads stories better than anyone. He does all the voices. Sarah was the last to speak, her response measured and thoughtful. I think Papa would want you to be happy, Mama, and I think Zachary makes you happy. Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes. You're all very wise for such young people, she said, gathering them into a group embrace. Nothing has been decided yet, but I wanted you to know that whatever happens, we're a family first. Always. The conversation with the children eased Eliza's mind considerably. Their acceptance, even encouragement, of a potential relationship with Zachary removed one significant barrier. But there were others: the fact that he was her employer, the potential gossip such a match would generate, and her own lingering grief for Jeremiah. Yet as July progressed, the connection between Eliza and Zachary deepened despite these concerns. They began taking evening walks together after the children were asleep, strolling along the creek in the relative cool of twilight, talking of everything and nothing. Zachary spoke of his hopes for the ranch, his regrets about the years spent in self-imposed exile in California, his tentative dreams for the future. Eliza shared memories of Jeremiah, stories of the children's early years, and gradually, her own hopes for what might be possible in this new life they were building. One such evening, as they sat on a fallen log watching the fireflies dance above the creek, Zachary took her hand in his. The gesture had become familiar over the past weeks, but tonight there was a new tension in his touch. Eliza, he began, his voice rough with emotion, I need to speak plainly with you. She turned to face him, her heart quickening at his serious tone. I'm listening. Zachary took a deep breath. When I returned to Texas, I had no expectation of finding happiness again. My goal was simply to make peace with the past, to build something meaningful with whatever years remained to me. He paused, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. And then I saw you that day in Austin, standing at a crossroads, and something shifted. Eliza remained silent, allowing him to find the words he needed. I told myself I was merely helping a neighbor in need, fulfilling a debt to Jeremiah's memory, he continued. But the truth, which I've been reluctant to admit even to myself, is far simpler and more profound. His blue eyes found hers in the gathering darkness. I'm falling in love with you, Eliza, perhaps have already fallen, completely and irrevocably. The declaration hung in the air between them, both terrifying and exhilarating in its honesty. Eliza felt as if she stood on the edge of a precipice, with safety behind her and an unknown future ahead. Zachary, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I care for you deeply. These past months have been transformative. You've given me and my children so much, not just shelter and security, but hope. She hesitated. But I'm afraid. Of what? He asked gently. Of disappointment, of loss, of opening my heart fully only to have it broken again. She squeezed his hand. I lost Jeremiah so suddenly, with no chance to prepare or say goodbye. The pain nearly destroyed me. Zachary nodded, understanding in his eyes. I know that fear intimately, Eliza. It kept me alone for 15 years. And yet here you are, she said softly. Here I am, he agreed. Because some risks are worth taking, some possibilities too precious to ignore out of fear. He reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, only that you consider the possibility of us together. Not as employer and housekeeper, but as equals, partners, perhaps someday as husband and wife. The word wife sent a tremor through Eliza. She had never imagined herself married again, had resigned herself to widowhood and the limited options it afforded. The children, she began. I've grown to love them, Zachary said simply. Sarah's intelligence and quiet strength, Thomas's curiosity and enthusiasm, Mary's sweetness and imagination. They're part of you, Eliza, and therefore already dear to me. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes at the sincerity in his voice. I need time, she said. Not to determine my feelings, those are clearer to me each day, but to be certain this is right for all of us. Zachary nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Take all the time you need. I've waited 15 years to feel this way again. I can be patient a while longer. They walked back to the house hand in hand, the unspoken promise of a shared future hovering between them like the fireflies that lit their path through the darkness. August arrived with blistering heat and the promise of change. Eliza found herself watching Zachary with new awareness, the strength in his hands as he worked with the horses, the kindness in his eyes when he listened to the children's stories, the quiet authority he commanded among the ranch hands. She noticed, too, the way his gaze followed her across a room, the gentle brush of his fingers against hers when he passed her the salt at dinner, the deepening of his voice when they were alone together in the evenings. The children, perceptive as always, seemed to sense the shifting dynamics. Sarah began asking Zachary's opinion on her reading selections, seeking his approval in a way that spoke volumes about her acceptance of his growing role in their lives. Thomas shadowed him even more devotedly, soaking up knowledge about ranching with an eagerness that made Zachary beam with pride. Even little Mary had taken to calling him Zach, with casual affection, climbing into his lap each evening for a story before bedtime. One sweltering afternoon, as Eliza was reviewing the household accounts in the relative cool of the parlor, Sarah approached her with an unusually hesitant expression. "Mama, may I ask you something?" the girl said, settling onto the sofa beside Eliza's chair. "Of course, darling," Eliza replied, setting aside her ledger. Sarah twisted her hands in her lap, a sign of nervousness she had inherited from Jeremiah. "Is Zachary going to be our new papa?" The directness of the question caught Eliza off guard. "Why do you ask?" "Because you look at him the way you used to look at Papa," Sarah said simply. "And because he looks at you like you're the most important person in the world." Eliza felt her cheeks warm. "Zachary and I have discussed the possibility of a future together," she admitted. "But nothing has been decided." Sarah nodded, her young face serious. "I think I would like it if he was," she said after a moment. "He's different from Papa, but good different, and he makes you happy." "And you, Sarah, does he make you happy?" The girl considered this carefully. "He listens when I talk, really listens. And he doesn't treat me like a baby. Yesterday he showed me how to balance the feed accounts and said I have a head for figures, just like you." A small smile touched her lips. "I like that he sees me, Mama, not just as your daughter, but as Sarah." Eliza's heart swelled with love for this thoughtful child who had carried so much weight on her young shoulders. "Your opinion matters greatly to me," she said, reaching out to tuck a strand of dark hair behind Sarah's ear. "All of your opinions do. Thomas and Mary already adore him," Sarah said. "And I think I might too, a little." She hesitated, then added softly, "I don't think Papa would mind. He always said he wanted us to be happy no matter what." "Your father was a good man," Eliza agreed, her throat tight with emotion. "One of the best I've ever known." "Until Zachary," Sarah said with the simple clarity of youth. Eliza couldn't deny it. Jeremiah would always hold a sacred place in her heart as her first love and the father of her children. but Zachary had awakened feelings she thought long buried, offering a second chance at happiness she had never expected to find. "Until Zachary," she agreed softly. The conversation with Sarah stayed with Eliza throughout the day, influencing her thoughts as she went about her duties. By evening, when the children were asleep, and she joined Zachary for their customary walk, she had reached a decision. They strolled in companionable silence to their favorite spot by the creek, where a large flat rock provided a natural seat overlooking the water. The heat of the day had yielded to a more bearable warmth, with the promise of a cooling breeze coming from the east. "You're quiet tonight," Zachary observed as they settled side by side on the rock. Eliza nodded, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking about what you said, about us. About possibilities." Zachary went very still beside her, his breathing shallow as he waited for her to continue. "Sarah asked me today if you were going to be their new papa," Eliza said, watching his profile in the fading light. Surprise flickered across his features. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That we had discussed the possibility of a future together, but that nothing had been decided." Eliza took a deep breath. "She said she would like it if you were." Zachary turned to face her fully, hope dawning in his eyes. "And you, Eliza, what would you like?" "I would like that too," she said softly. "Very much." For a moment, Zachary seemed unable to speak, his emotions playing openly across his face: joy, disbelief, tenderness. Then he reached for her, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with feeling. Eliza nodded, her heart pounding as Zachary leaned forward. His lips met hers with exquisite gentleness, a question rather than a demand. She responded with a shy eagerness that soon gave way to deeper emotion as the kiss lengthened and his arms encircled her, drawing her against his solid chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Eliza Foster," he whispered, "with all that I am and all that I have to give." "And I love you, Zachary Owens," she replied, the words coming easily now that the barrier between them had fallen. "More than I thought possible to love again." They remained by the creek for a long time, talking of the future, exchanging soft kisses and tentative caresses, learning each other in this new way. When they finally returned to the house, hand in hand beneath the star-filled Texas sky, Eliza felt as if she were walking in a dream, one from which she had no desire to wake. The following weeks passed in a haze of joy and planning. Zachary formally proposed 3 days after their first kiss, kneeling before Eliza in the parlor with all 3 children as witnesses. The ring he offered had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band set with a single diamond that caught the light like a promise. "It's not elaborate," he apologized as he slipped it onto her finger, "but it's been in my family for generations, a symbol of enduring love." "It's perfect," Eliza assured him, tears of happiness blurring her vision as the children cheered and Manuel and Lucia, who had been discreetly watching from the doorway, offered their congratulations. They set the wedding date for mid-September, when the worst of the summer heat would have passed, but before the busy fall cattle sales began. The ceremony would be held at the ranch, with the minister from Austin officiating and only a small gathering of friends to witness their vows. "Nothing elaborate," Zachary insisted when Eliza worried about the preparations. "Just us, the children, and those who matter most to us." Eliza agreed, though she did engage a seamstress in Austin to make new dresses for herself and the girls, and proper suits for Thomas and Zachary. The cottage where they had lived since arriving at the Rocking Z would become a guest house, as Eliza and the children would move into the main house permanently after the wedding. As the day approached, Eliza found herself filled with a nervous anticipation that had nothing to do with the ceremony itself, and everything to do with what would follow. It had been so long since she had been intimate with a man, years of loneliness stretching behind her like a desert. Though Zachary was unfailingly gentle and respectful in his attentions, the heat in his gaze when they were alone together left no doubt about his desires. The night before the wedding, after the children were asleep and the last-minute preparations complete, Eliza found Zachary standing on the veranda, looking out at the starlit landscape of the ranch. "Second thoughts?" she asked softly, coming to stand beside him. He turned to her with a smile that dispelled any such notion. "Never. Only gratitude that tomorrow you'll be my wife in truth, not just in my dreams." Eliza leaned into him as his arm circled her waist. "It hardly seems real sometimes," she admitted. 6 months ago, I was at the lowest point of my life, with no hope and no future I could envision for myself or my children. And now, Zachary prompted gently. "Now I can hardly contain my happiness," she finished, turning in his arms to face him. "You've given us so much, Zachary." "A home, security, love," he silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. "You've given me far more, Eliza. Purpose, family, a reason to wake each morning with joy instead of resignation." His hand moved to cup her cheek. "You've brought life back to this ranch and to me." Their kiss was deeper than usual, charged with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring a new chapter in their shared story. When they reluctantly parted, Zachary's eyes held a promise that made Eliza's breath catch. "Until tomorrow, my love," he murmured, pressing one last kiss to her forehead before releasing her. "Until tomorrow," she echoed, her voice steady despite the fluttering of her heart. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, as if nature itself approved of their union. Lucia and Sarah helped Eliza prepare in the cottage, arranging her hair with wildflowers and assisting her into the new dress of pale blue silk that complemented her eyes and brought a healthy glow to her cheeks. "You look beautiful, Mama," Sarah said, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she surveyed her mother's appearance. "The most beautiful bride," Lucia agreed, adjusting the simple veil that would cover Eliza's face until Zachary lifted it after their vows. A knock at the door heralded Thomas, resplendent in his new suit with his hair slicked down in a failed attempt to tame his cowlicks. "Manuel says everything's ready," he announced importantly. "And Zachary looks like he might be sick, but in a good way." Eliza laughed, her nervousness dissolving at her son's artless description. "Then we shouldn't keep him waiting," she said, taking a deep breath. "Are you ready to give me away, Thomas?" In the absence of a father or brother to perform the traditional role, Thomas had proudly volunteered to escort his mother down the makeshift aisle that had been created between rows of chairs on the lawn before the house. He nodded solemnly, offering his small arm with a gravity that belied his 8 years. "Ready, Mama." The ceremony itself passed in a blur for Eliza. She was aware of the guests, Manuel and Lucia's extended family, Dr. Wilson and his wife, Mr. Wilkins from the general store, a few other shopkeepers and neighbors from Austin, and all the ranch hands in their Sunday best. She noticed the decorations of wildflowers and ribbons that Sarah and Mary had helped arrange, the arch of branches under which the minister waited. But most of all, she was aware of Zachary, standing tall and handsome in his new suit, his blue eyes never leaving hers as she walked toward him on Thomas's arm. Their vows were traditional but spoken with profound sincerity. When Zachary placed the gold band beside its diamond companion on Eliza's finger, his hands trembled slightly, betraying the depth of his emotion. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was both a promise and a fulfillment. The celebration afterward was joyous but simple, a feast prepared by Lucia with help from the women of her family. Music provided by one of the ranch hands who played the fiddle, and dancing that lasted until the sun began to set. Mary fell asleep in Manuel's arms, worn out from excitement and too much cake. Thomas engaged in spirited play with the other children present until he, too, succumbed to exhaustion. Sarah, growing into her role as the eldest, helped Lucia clear away dishes and made sure the younger children were settled. As twilight deepened, the guests began to depart, offering final congratulations and well wishes. Manuel and Lucia had volunteered to stay with the children in the main house for the night, giving the newlyweds privacy in the cottage for their first evening as husband and wife. When the last guest had gone and the children were safely tucked in, Zachary led Eliza across the lawn toward the cottage, which had been transformed in her absence. Candles illuminated the small rooms, their golden light softening the familiar surroundings. Fresh flowers filled vases on every available surface, their sweet scent mingling with the clean, crisp smell of new linens on the bed. "Lucia's touch," Zachary explained, noticing Eliza's surprise at the romantic setting. "She insisted we deserved a proper bridal chamber, even if it's only for one night." Eliza felt a blush rise to her cheeks at the thought of what that one night would entail. Despite her earlier marriage and 3 children, she suddenly felt as nervous as a maiden bride. Zachary seemed to sense her apprehension. "We have all the time in the world," he said gently, taking her hands in his. "There's no rush, Eliza. Nothing needs to happen tonight that you're not ready for." His consideration touched her deeply. "It's not that I'm unwilling," she explained, her voice soft in the candle-lit room. "It's just been so long and I'm not as young as I was when Jeremiah and I married." Zachary's smile was tender as he drew her closer. "You are more beautiful to me now than any young girl could ever be," he said. "Your strength, your courage, your capacity for love despite hardship, these are the qualities that captured my heart, Eliza. Not youth or perfection." As he spoke, his hands moved to the pins in her hair, carefully removing them until the dark waves fell loose around her shoulders. "I want to know all of you," he murmured, his fingers combing gently through the strands. "And I want you to know me, not just the man I present to the world, but the man I am when all pretenses fall away." The vulnerability in his admission melted the last of Eliza's hesitation. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that time and experience had etched around his eyes and mouth. "Show me then," she whispered, "and let me show you." Their coming together was slow and tender, a gradual discovery of each other's bodies and responses. Zachary was a patient lover, attentive to Eliza's needs and generous with his own pleasure. In his arms, she found herself reawakening to sensations long forgotten, the sweet ache of desire, the building tension of passion, the exquisite release of fulfillment. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the sheets, Zachary's heart beat strong and steady beneath her cheek. Eliza felt a profound sense of homecoming. This man, this place, this life they were building together, it was more than she had dared to hope for in her darkest days. "What are you thinking?" Zachary asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Eliza smiled against his chest. "That I'm thankful for you, for this second chance at happiness." "Second chances are precious," he agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And I intend to make the most of ours." Eliza Owens. The name, spoken for the first time, sent a thrill through her. Eliza Owens. Not just Jeremiah's widow, not just the desperate woman who had stood outside the Painted Lady contemplating the unthinkable. A woman with a future, a partner, a love that had found her when she least expected it. "As do I," she promised, lifting her face to his for a kiss that sealed their covenant more profoundly than any words could express. Life at the Rocking Z settled into a new pattern in the weeks following the wedding. The children adapted quickly to living in the main house, each finding their own favorite spaces. Sarah in the library, Thomas in Zachary's study where maps of the ranch property fascinated him for hours, Mary in the kitchen where Lucia taught her to roll tortillas with patient hands. For Eliza, the transition from housekeeper to mistress of the ranch brought both challenges and joys. Though she continued to oversee the household affairs, her role expanded to include hostess duties when neighboring ranchers visited, confidante to Zachary as he made decisions about the ranch's future, and increasingly, partner in those decisions. October brought the cattle sales, a busy time that kept Zachary away for days as he traveled to markets in San Antonio and even as far as Dallas. His return from these trips was always marked by joyous reunions, the children racing to greet him at the gate while Eliza watched from the veranda, her heart full at the sight of her family, for that was what they had become, against all odds. One evening in late October, as they sat together on the veranda watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Zachary broached a subject they had not yet discussed. "Eliza," he began, his tone careful, "I've been thinking about the future, about our family." She turned to look at him, noting the slight uncertainty in his expression. "What about our family?" Zachary reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding band on her finger. "I was wondering how you might feel about expanding it." The question hung between them, its implications clear. Eliza had not considered the possibility of more children at her age, with 3 already half-grown. Yet the thought, now planted, took root with surprising swiftness. "Are you asking if I would want another child?" she clarified. Zachary nodded, watching her face closely. "Only if it's something you would welcome. I know you've already raised 3 wonderful children, largely on your own. I would understand if you felt that chapter of your life was complete." Eliza considered the question carefully. She was 39, not too old to bear another child safely, but certainly past the age when most women were still expanding their families. Yet the thought of a baby, Zachary's baby, filled her with unexpected longing. "I think I would like that very much," she said softly. "A child of our own to join our family." The joy that spread across Zachary's face was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. He drew her into his arms, his kiss speaking volumes about his feelings on the matter. "The children," he asked when they broke apart. "How do you think they would feel?" Eliza smiled, thinking of Mary's love for the kittens and puppies born on the ranch, Thomas's protective nature toward younger children, Sarah's maternal instincts that were already emerging as she approached adolescence. "I think they might surprise us with their enthusiasm," she said. "Especially Mary. She's been asking for a baby sister since she was old enough to talk." Zachary laughed, the sound rich and full in the gathering twilight. "Then we shall have to see what we can do about fulfilling her wish," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone that sent a pleasant shiver through Eliza. "Though I'm afraid we can't guarantee a girl." "A healthy child is all that matters," Eliza replied, leaning into his embrace as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. November passed without any sign that their hopes for a child would be immediately fulfilled, but Eliza was not discouraged. The ranch kept them all busy as preparations for winter occupied their days, preserving the last of the garden harvest, ensuring adequate feed was stored for the livestock, making repairs to buildings before the cold weather set in. On a crisp December morning, as Eliza was helping Lucia prepare breakfast, a wave of dizziness washed over her, accompanied by a sudden queasiness that sent her hurrying outside for fresh air. It was the third such episode in a week, and Lucia watched her with knowing eyes as she returned to the kitchen, color slowly returning to her cheeks. "Senora Eliza," the older woman said gently, "perhaps it is time to speak with Dr. Wilson, yes?" Eliza met her gaze, understanding dawning. "You think I might be?" Lucia nodded, a smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "I have seen it many times. The sickness in the morning, the tiredness, the way your face changes softer, glowing." Hope bloomed in Eliza's chest, tempered by caution. "It's early days if I am," she said. "And at my age, I shouldn't get too excited until I'm certain." "The heart knows before the head sometimes," Lucia replied with the wisdom of experience. "And your heart is already singing with the knowledge, I think." Unable to deny the truth of Lucia's observation, Eliza simply squeezed the woman's hand in silent gratitude for her perception and discretion. That evening, when she and Zachary were alone in their bedroom, Eliza shared her suspicions. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for, joy tempered with concern for her health, excitement balanced with patience. "We'll wait to tell the children until we're certain," he said as they lay together in the darkness, his hand resting protectively over her still flat abdomen. "But Eliza, if it's true, if we're to have a child together—" "I know," she whispered, covering his hand with her own. "It feels like a miracle." A visit from Dr. Wilson the following week confirmed what Eliza's body had already told her. She was indeed expecting a child, due to arrive in the early summer of the coming year. The news, when shared with the children over a special Sunday dinner, was met with exactly the enthusiasm Eliza had predicted. Mary clapped her hands in delight at the prospect of a baby brother or sister. Thomas immediately began planning the things he would teach the new addition to their family. Sarah, now 11 and increasingly aware of adult concerns, asked practical questions about Eliza's health and how they could help during the coming months. "Are you happy about the baby, Zachary?" Mary asked directly, her young face serious as she studied her stepfather across the table. Zachary's smile was radiant as he reached for Eliza's hand. "More happy than I can express, little one. This baby is a blessing I never expected to receive at my age." "You're not that old," Thomas declared loyally. "Manuel's father is way older, and he still rides horses and everything." The comparison made them all laugh, easing any lingering tension about how the news might be received. As the meal concluded and the children dispersed to their various activities, Zachary drew Eliza into his study for a moment of privacy. "Are you truly well?" he asked, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he searched her face for any sign of discomfort or worry. "I am," she assured him. "Doctor Wilson says I'm in excellent health, and while he'll monitor me closely because of my age, he sees no reason to expect anything but a normal pregnancy and delivery." Relief eased the lines around Zachary's eyes. "I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you, Eliza. You and the children, all four of you now, are everything to me." The depth of emotion in his voice touched Eliza deeply. She reached up to stroke his cheek, her fingers tracing the now familiar contours of his face. "We're stronger than you think, Zachary Owens. This baby and I will be fine." She smiled mischievously. "Though you may find yourself regretting your wish for another child when I'm as big as a house and complaining about swollen ankles come May." Zachary laughed, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "I shall consider it my duty and privilege to massage those ankles and fetch whatever odd combinations of food you might crave at midnight." "I'll hold you to that promise," Eliza warned him, settling comfortably against his chest as the December wind rattled the windows of their home. Winter passed in a blur of holiday celebrations, quiet evenings by the fire, and the gradual rounding of Eliza's figure as the new life within her grew. Zachary proved true to his word, attentive to her needs and endearingly anxious about her well-being. The children, too, adjusted to the idea of a new sibling, each in their own way. Sarah took on additional responsibilities around the house to spare Eliza exertion. Thomas appointed himself her personal escort, offering his arm whenever she walked anywhere on the ranch. Mary spent hours talking to the baby through Eliza's expanding belly, convinced that her future sibling could hear and understand every word. Spring brought new life to the rocking Z in more ways than one. Calves were born, wildflowers carpeted the hillsides, and Eliza's pregnancy progressed without complications, despite Dr. Wilson's initial concerns about her age. By May, she had indeed reached the stage of swollen ankles and restless nights that she had jokingly predicted, but she bore these discomforts with good humor, grateful for the miracle growing within her. On a warm evening in early June, as Eliza sat on the veranda watching the children play a game of tag on the lawn, the first contraction seized her with unexpected intensity. She gripped the arms of her rocking chair, breathing through the pain as Zachary had taught her, based on his recollections of Emily's labor with their son. When the contraction passed, she called calmly to Sarah, who was supervising the younger children's play. "Sarah, dear, would you fetch Zachary from the barn? Tell him it's time." The girl's eyes widened with understanding, and she nodded solemnly before running toward the barn where Zachary was inspecting a new foal with Manuel. Within minutes, he was at Eliza's side, his face a mixture of excitement and concern as he helped her to their bedroom, where Lucia was already preparing the necessary items for the birth. "I've sent Miguel for Dr. Wilson," Zachary assured her as he settled her on the bed they shared. "And Manuel has gone to collect the midwife from the Hernandez ranch." Eliza nodded, another contraction beginning to build. "There's time," she managed through gritted teeth. "First babies often take their time arriving." Though this was her fourth child, not her first, neither of them corrected the statement. This was in many ways a first for both of them, their first child together. Zachary's first experience of supporting a wife through labor, their first shared creation of a new life. The labor progressed steadily throughout the night. Dr. Wilson arrived shortly before midnight, the midwife an hour later. Together they guided Eliza through the intensifying contractions, while Zachary remained steadfastly at her side, wiping her brow with cool cloths and providing a strong hand to grip during the worst of the pain. Dawn was breaking over the eastern hills when the final stages of labor began in earnest. Eliza, exhausted but determined, focused all her remaining strength on bringing their child into the world. Zachary's encouragement never wavered, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of sensation that consumed her. "One more push, Mrs. Owens," Dr. Wilson urged as the sun's first rays illuminated the bedroom. "Your baby is almost here." With a cry that was half pain and half triumph, Eliza bore down one last time. A moment of searing pressure, then sudden relief as the baby slipped into the doctor's waiting hands. A brief, breathless pause, then the most beautiful sound Eliza had ever heard, the indignant wail of a newborn protesting its abrupt introduction to the world. "A boy," Dr. Wilson announced, placing the squirming, vernix-covered infant on Eliza's chest. "A fine, healthy son." Tears streamed down Zachary's face as he gazed at their child, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to touch the damp, dark hair that covered the tiny head. "He's perfect," he whispered, voice choked with emotion. "Eliza, you're amazing, thank you." The baby, sensing his mother's warmth, gradually quieted, his cries softening to whimpers and then to contented sighs as Eliza cradled him against her skin. His eyes, when they opened briefly, were the unfocused blue of all newborns, but Eliza could already see hints of his father in the shape of his small face. "What shall we name him?" she asked softly, looking up at Zachary, who seemed unable to tear his gaze from their son. They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but had never settled on a final choice, wanting to meet their child first before deciding. "William," Zachary said after a moment's consideration. "After my father, William Jeremiah Owens." The inclusion of her first husband's name as their son's middle name was a gesture of such profound respect and understanding that fresh tears welled in Eliza's eyes. "It's perfect," she agreed. "Welcome to the world, William Jeremiah." Later that morning, after Eliza had been cleaned up and allowed to rest, the door to the bedroom opened to admit three anxious faces: Sarah, Thomas, and Mary, all eager to meet their new brother. They approached the bed with uncharacteristic caution, their eyes wide with wonder as Zachary carefully placed the swaddled infant in Sarah's arms. "He's so tiny," Thomas marveled, peering over his sister's shoulder. "But perfect," Mary declared, gently touching the baby's cheek with one finger. "Hello, baby brother. I'm your big sister Mary." Zachary stood back, watching as his stepchildren welcomed their half-brother with unconditional love, and Eliza saw in his eyes the same emotion that filled her heart: overwhelming gratitude for this family they had created together, against all odds and expectations. In the days that followed, as Eliza recovered her strength and little William adjusted to life outside the womb, the rocking Z was filled with a palpable sense of joy and completion. Neighbors and friends from Austin visited to offer congratulations and gifts for the newest Owens. Even Mr. Halloway, now sober and somewhat humbled by time and circumstance, sent a carved wooden rattle with a note of apology for his behavior at the Independence Day celebration the previous year. Zachary, who had initially planned to hire additional help for the household during Eliza's confinement, found himself reluctant to leave the house at all, preferring to spend every possible moment with his wife and newborn son. The ranch hands, understanding and supportive, managed the daily operations with Manuel's capable leadership, allowing their boss this precious time with his family. One evening, as summer settled fully over the Texas hills, Eliza sat in the rocking chair on the veranda, nursing William as the sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues. The other children were helping Lucia prepare supper, their laughter drifting through the open windows of the kitchen. Zachary, having just returned from a brief inspection of the north pasture, settled in the chair beside her, his face relaxed and content. "Happy?" he asked softly, reaching over to stroke William's downy head as the baby suckled contentedly at Eliza's breast. Eliza smiled, looking out over the ranch that had become her home, the green pastures where cattle grazed, the creek lined with cottonwoods, the sturdy barn and corrals, and beyond it all, the endless Texas sky. Then she looked at the man beside her, whose love had given her not just material security but emotional sanctuary, whose strength had supported rather than dominated her, whose heart had opened to embrace not just her but her children as his own. "More than happy," she replied, her voice rich with emotion. "Complete." Zachary's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as they had that day in Austin when he had first offered her an alternative to despair. "From the moment I saw you standing there," he said quietly, "something told me our paths were meant to cross, that we were each other's second chance." "Not just a second chance," Eliza corrected gently. "A new beginning for all of us." As if in agreement, William released her breast with a contented sigh, his tiny face peaceful in the glow of the setting sun. Zachary took him carefully, cradling him against his shoulder with the growing confidence of a new father. "A new beginning," he echoed, gazing at his son with wonder that hadn't diminished in the weeks since his birth. "One I never dared to hope for until you came into my life." Eliza watched them, this man and child who had completed her family in ways she could never have imagined on that desperate morning in Austin. The road that had brought her here from widow to near destitution, to the brink of selling herself, and finally to this moment of perfect contentment had been arduous and painful at times. Yet she wouldn't change a step of it, for each one, even the darkest, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky, Eliza Owens offered a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for the courage to embrace them, and for the love that had transformed a house into a home and a collection of wounded souls into a family. The ranch around them settled into the rhythms of nightfall cattle lowing in distant pastures, horses nickering in the barn, the soft murmur of the creek as it wound its way through the property. And at the heart of it all, on the veranda of the house that had once stood empty and neglected, a family gathered in the warm embrace of love fulfilled and promises kept. It was, Eliza reflected as Zachary leaned over to press a gentle kiss to her lips, everything she had ever wanted and more than she had ever dared to dream.